You're listening to Viewpoint, a podcast of Highlands Church. Welcome, everyone. A Viewpoint is a podcast discussing challenging cultural issues from the Bible's point of view, and we want to help equip the church to be able to encounter the world around us with the truth of the gospel. I am joined, as always, by our pastor of adult education, Joe and Franco. Welcome, Joe.
Well, hi, Brendan. Good to be with you.
Yes, and today we are talking about transgenderism. Transgenderism, the issues surrounding it. Transgender issues are constantly in the news right now. It's a factor in schools and education. Governments are wrestling with laws surrounding transgender individuals. The medical community is in constant debate about the treatment and care for those individuals. And the conversations really are only getting more polarized and louder. So we want to talk about this. And to help us through this discussion, we have a special guest in a way today. We're actually going to be listening to and discussing some excerpts from an interview that, Joe, you did last year with Walt Heyer. Can you tell us a little bit about Walt?
Yeah, so Walt is a friend. I know him, I want to say it's about 12 years now. And I met Walt during my legal career. Walt is famously known for having detransitioned. Walt is, I want to say, about 83 years old now. And he lived for 8 years presenting himself as a woman. He had a dramatic conversion to Christ, became a believer, and then detransitioned. After detransitioning, he recognized the mistakes that he had made, particularly in not dealing with the underlying psychological pathologies. And then he has become a voice for that subject. He's got websites that are well known, that get millions of hits. He gets thousands of emails every week, and he answers them all. He is the most gracious, kind, generous man you can imagine. He's happily married for over 20 years. He detransitioned and married his wife, and so this is his, now he feels God has given him this ministry, this mission, to help people, particularly those with transgender regret. And his websites and books are dedicated to that topic.
Walt was such a blessing to have him here to be encouraging, answering questions with our church family. That was a great thing. So before we dive into sort of the beginning of the first clip that we're going to hear from Walt, let's take a quick step back and just talk real basic biblically as a church, what we believe about transgenderism, what we believe the Bible speaks into that particular issue.
Yeah, and we would say this is an important point because it's a creational issue. And we would say the Bible teaches clearly in Genesis that God created them male and female. And Jesus affirms that God is the creator. And Matthew 19, verses 4 and 5, in the context of marriage, Jesus affirms male. He created them male and female for that purpose. And those creation distinctives are how, of course, we have children. The human species has the potential to reproduce, but only in that context. So we would say we do not have the ability to recreate ourselves in our own likeness and image.
Yes, that's the core of what we are dealing with in these transgender issues, is this idea of recreation in the way that we think, as opposed to creation as the way that God actually created. And what we're going to hear is how those the implications of doing that recreation on our own, how that starts to play out in culture as well.
You know, this is a really important concept. Is there such a thing as truth? And when you fall into subjectivism, you essentially say you define your own truth, but there is a truth as God sees it. How do we know that? Well, Jesus says, you shall know the truth will set you free, or I am the way, the truth, and the life. Does God really have truth that he wants us to know, that he says we're capable of knowing? And the Bible would say yes. Now, having said that, the people who have these questions have legitimate difficulties, pain, problem, issues. We love those people. We love them without exception. We want to minister to people like that. And I think some of what we'll hear in Walt's conversation is it's helpful for people to stop and ask, why do they feel that confusion? Why does the girl feel like she would be better suited, if she were a boy, or vice versa? So we want to help people with perhaps, those kinds of issues and that kind of awareness. But we would say that this is a creational issue, and we are not given the ability to recreate ourselves in our own likeness and image. yes, we're creative, and there are all kinds of issues we face. You really get into that massive, difficult to approach subject of the sovereignty of God and our coming to grips with God having made us a certain way with certain capacities, certain talents, certain physical abilities or limitations. And what does God expect for us during the time that we sojourn, that we live in this world? How do we honor God with the circumstances that he saw fit to introduce us to this world?
Yeah, and that's a great overview of where we are, looking at every person made in God's image, worthy of dignity and value and love, but also recognizing that God is the creator, and he created male and female and created with a purpose and on purpose. And so with that, we're going to get into the first clip that we have of your discussion with Walt. So people are going to hear Joe engage in the conversation with Walt as well. And the place we started really in this conversation was some of the consequences and results just in society and culture as a whole of transgenderism and how that plays out.
It seems that as Christians, we understand God created them male and female.
Right.
But when somebody now says, yes, I'm a man, but I want to become a woman, what does that do to creational truth?
Well, of course, it turns it on its head, but what they're really doing, just like I did, is you're actually shaking your fist at God and saying, you didn't get me right. I'm going to fix this. And by shaking your fist at God, you're absolutely denying what is real. You're going into fantasy land, and it's delusional to think that you can become that way. But we have to understand that, as in my life, there was some harm done that caused you to not want to be who you are.
The reality of a man never ceases, to be a man, and a woman a woman. What does that look like? You've seen some of the instances like the track cases and all that. There were biological men competing against women. In the state of Connecticut, which allows that, the women's records have now been set by a few men, and the records for the state history are gone. The scholarships that were intended for women are now taken away. That's one of the consequences of this type of thing.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the men are going to be much more powerful. We saw this especially in the track case. The women couldn't even, the fastest woman in the country wasn't even anywhere near the slowest time that the third man that was in this case was. They just can't compete. But what's so interesting about the opposite side of this is that there was a case where a girl became a boy and in swimming, and she couldn't even come close to competing with the men. So you can see the tremendous disadvantage. So we really need to abolish this idea because they're men.
So you'll hear, for example, the NCAA says, well, if a man takes, hormones for a while, a man takes estrogen to a certain level, that negates the advantage. Is that the case?
Yeah, well, it doesn't change it. I took hormones for many years, and I got at college in San Mateo and got on a little tennis team, and they couldn't even return my serves. And I'm in my 40s, and they're in their 20s. I mean, I could smash it. And they go, oh, this is unfair. Well, it was.
Yeah, well,
and I liked it at the time, actually. True confession, I was having a ball. I never lost a match.
And the reality of it is, a man taking estrogen will develop feminine characteristics, let's say.
Yeah.
But nothing happens to muscle mass, bone density, lung capacity. All those things are real, and occasionally there's the aha moment. There was a mixed martial arts fight, and the British commentator Piers Morgan, sort of on the left side of the equation, watched a biological man who identifies as a woman, and he fought a woman who was kind of high up, close to champion caliber, and just demolished her in seconds. When you see the pictures of it, and once the man did this, his exact quote was, for him, it was the moment ideology met cold, hard reality.
So it's clear that this is what's happening. So there's been a recreation. People are saying, no, I think I should be this, even though I was created this. And so now the consequences are playing out across society. Sports teams and different areas are trying to figure out, well, what do we do with this? Our ideas of justice and fairness, it's all starting to crumble. I love some of what you guys were discussing there. What are the implications?
Yeah, that's right. You run into reality. You might think you can fly and jump off of a building, and eventually the objective truth sets in. The fact is, if archaeologists discovered the bones of a transgender individual hundreds of years from now, they would look and they would conclude correctly that this person was biologically male or female, because there's just an objective truth that does not change. And while we're generalizing, and sometimes people say things that are unfortunate, like, oh, well, there are great women athletes. Well, that's absolutely true. There's no question about that. That's not the point. The point is the top 1% of male athletes in nearly any sport will dominate and completely smash every woman's record, because there are creational differences. And so once you suspend creational truth, you inevitably run into these types of issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I will say there can be a tendency, especially among the Christian community, to just then immediately go into a panic. How can this be happening? We need to stop this outrage, having confrontation. And really what I think that reaction does is misses the fact that these are all real people with real stories that we really need to get to know. And that's on this next clip where Walt starts to go, as you guys have a conversation about what's really going on inside each of the individuals and how important it is to start to learn their stories.
But people who are doing this are really hurting people. Mm-hmm. How do we convey to people that we love them, that we respect every human being made in the image of God, and every one of us is? How do we convey our love for them and our desire for their best while not accepting their assumption that I've become a woman by thinking I am one, or something like that? How do we love the person but not approve of the message?
Yeah, well, it's not easy, because sometimes they won't even let you discuss the issue with them because they don't want to talk about it. But when we have an opportunity to talk to somebody, I always suggest sit down and become a great listener and have them tell their story to you. And I always ask this one question: what happened that caused you to not like who you are? Simple question. What happened that caused you to not like who you are? And we have found out in doing this for many years that if we work long enough, oftentimes they won't disclose that early on in the emails or exchange or talk. But over a period of time, 100% of the people have been able to tell us what happened to them that caused them to not want to be who they are. Sexual abuse is real high on the list. We've not calculated it, but it's well over 60%, probably nearly 70%. There's other abuses, children who've been passed around from foster home to foster home. They just don't want to be who they are, or they end up in a bad situation, or their parents physically abused them or abandoned them, or they see in one case the mother is just not, she's an alcoholic or she's psychologically broken, and the kid's not getting the care, they're not getting the nurturing, and so they have these stories to tell, and we need to understand if we sit down with them and let them tell their story, if they're open to doing it, many of them won't be.
So let's drill down on it. I think this is an important thing. You mentioned comorbidities.
Right.
So isn't the typical situation that a human being has multiple pathologies?
Yeah.
And gender confusion tends to get kind of layered on top of that. And then when doctors do the disservice of focusing on the gender dysphoria, the gender identity issue, and they tell people that's what will fix you, but they never deal with the underlying pathologies, there's then the rush to conform the body, but what happens to those underlying pathologies? They're never dealt with.
Right, and this is where I get the idea that what I have found in the people that I've worked with, none of them have gender dysphoria. Gender dysphoria is the trash can diagnosis. Once you say somebody has gender dysphoria, it sort of ends the game. Okay, well then where do you go from there? Hormones, hormone blockers, surgery. Okay, if you take gender dysphoria out of the equation and say, what caused you to not like who you are? And you drill down, you find out, like the individual I'm working with now, he's 26 years old. He diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar 1 disorder, PTSD. He was sexually abused. He was in the care of a clinic on disability since 2013. This year, in 2020, in March, they gave him sex change surgery. He contacted me 8 weeks ago and said, I don't know why they did this. I'm not homosexual. And so we now are working to restore his life, not just from the schizophrenia and bipolar and PTSD. Now we have a whole nother set of issues. So if we go down and drill down and find out, was it body dysmorphia? Were they sexually abused? We need to understand what happened.
Okay, so Joe, I love Walt's question there and just his heart to reach out and love these people first. And his question, what happened that caused you to not like how you are? And then to sit and listen to their stories. That's so important.
Yeah, and we almost do ourselves a disservice in making transgenderism kind of its own separate category. What it is every one of us, we're all broken people. We're all separated from God. We get that we're all sinners. I could think of the things that I experienced in my life before I got saved at the age of 25. I had all kinds of issues, things I was dealing with. And when somebody stopped and listened to my story and shared Christ, something got through to me. So I think the idea of listening to a story is not so much for the purpose of saying, oh, well, this thing's worse than that, or how could you be this or that? It's just more, we're hearing somebody's life experience. We're hearing how they got where they did. And there are a lot of things, I'm mentoring a few guys, a couple of them lived in the streets and were homeless for a while. There were all kinds of life experiences that shape who we become. And in hearing that story, if we're really trying to show the love of Christ, we get to maybe help people see things and plug holes. The Holy Spirit gives insight into things that people have dealt with. People who have had, for example, absent fathers tend for some reason, and I've been told this by a number of Christian mental health professionals, that absentee father, somebody who never knows the father, will tend to project some of that kind of absenteeism on God. God's not really here for me and things like that. So hearing the story helps us to understand who a person is. And I think this is just another manifestation of what happens to people who are hurting, who go through life experiences that are challenging.
Yeah, and the beautiful part about what Walt does is he then hears those stories, understands, comes alongside, and then starts to begin to bring just the beautiful truth of who God is and how much he loves them and how he created them to be and why he would have done that, and starts having those conversations and walking through, as he talked about, the people that they get to work with. It really is a great picture of forming a relationship and then in love being able to speak some life into what God's design is.
I love Walt's approach. Tell me your story. Let me hear what happened. When did this occur to you that this was a kind of an issue? And I think anytime you're dealing in that area, the God part of the picture now comes in. What's happening here? What are the assumptions in my life that are creating some difficulties?
And then, of course, as those conversations happen, then there's the opportunity to talk those things through. And then what Walt shared with us, and we'll hear in this next clip, is when it comes to those individuals now experiencing regret and how high that rate is and what some of the implications are, also addressing the idea of the issue of suicide, which is so often brought into this, that oftentimes parents who have a child who says, I want to be the other gender, are counseled by medical professionals or psychologists to say, well, you have to just let that happen because otherwise your son or daughter will want to commit suicide, and that's really the only way forward. And so Walt gets into all of that in this next clip.
Yeah, the common formulation is, somebody was told, better to have a live daughter than a dead son, or vice versa. And think of the guilt that puts on a parent. What does a parent do? Even if a parent feels like there's something wrong about this or I'd like to have treatment, when a professional, a mental health professional is telling you you've got to do this, or essentially their death is going to be in your hands. Think of the poor parents in that situation. How were they going to respond?
Yes. And so through really, as you said, thousands of conversations that Walt has had with individuals who have identified as transgender, there's a little bit of nuance to it that he gets to draw. Let's take a listen.
So what we're seeing now, because those things are not dealt with, is the phenomenon of regret. And this now is where you come in. You're now starting to hear from the many, many thousands of people who experience that regret.
Yes.
Because what they needed was, they needed that healing, which we know only the Lord can bring. And in place of the healing, they were rushed to that. And now suddenly they're in a situation and they need help. They have transgender regret. Talk about the regret phenomenon. Kind of when does it kick in? What's your experience with it?
Yeah, here's that case I just mentioned. He's 26 years old. He had the surgery in March and he contacted me 8 weeks ago. So that period of time was very quick. Another young boy is an example of why we should be very, very skeptical about gender dysphoria as a diagnosis. These parents took their 15-year-old boy, Nathaniel, to a clinic, and they diagnosed him with gender dysphoria and started him on hormone blockers. And he went through all those processes all the way up to 18. At age 18, went to a clinic, had the full surgery, breast implants, genitals removed, and all that. Nathaniel wrote me an email 1 year later after the surgery, and he says, I feel like a Frankenstein monster. Can you help me get my life back? 1 year. So the typical time is somewhere between 3 and 10 years. I've had people contact me 30 years after surgery and say it took them 15 years to admit what they did was wrong. They were kept trying to make it work, and it never worked for them. So we're destroying lives needlessly because we're using the word gender dysphoria as the end game. Oh, now we do the hormones, now we do the surgery. No, find out what the comorbidity is and address those issues so that they no longer have the desire.
There are maybe glimmers of hope. And we have discussed this. Dr. Paul McHugh, renowned psychiatrist, was the head of a transgender clinic at Johns Hopkins University, one of the most prestigious, hospitals in the nation. And he saw the harm that was being done and shut down the clinic. And he used an expression like, we are partnering with madness, we're partnering with insanity. One of the things he observed, and I'd like to get your take on this, is that when children pre-puberty have gender confusion, the traditional treatment in psychiatry has always been do nothing. Because if you do nothing, through the process of puberty, there's a body-mind alignment that takes place. And McHugh said 85 to 95% of those young people will lose the gender confusion, and it will resolve in favor of the biology. Right. And that's always been the statistics in the profession. If you can put it this way, nature takes care of itself.
Right.
Has that been the experience?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think this is why it's so insidious to me that we're engaging in giving these young people hormone blockers, because if we leave them alone and allow them to grow through this process that God made for them to grow through, that there's a purpose for it. They develop into who they are through this process. We shouldn't be getting in the way of God and blocking this process. But what we do know is if we do block, they know that if they do block the process, they get them on the hormone blockers, they've got a much better chance of keeping them transgendered for the rest of their life. And they don't want them growing out of it, ladies and gentlemen. They don't want them to get better. They want the clinics to grow. They're getting money from the government to do this. And the issue about suicide, one of the most interesting things is you can go to suicide.org. And suicide.org says 90% of all suicides across the board are due to untreated mental disorders. So if you look at this category of people, they're not treating their mental disorders. They're just giving them hormones and telling them to go on. So absolutely, they're bound to have a high rate of suicide just because we're not dealing or looking for the underlying comorbidities. And so we know from Sweden that you're 19 times more likely to die by suicide after you transition than you are before. 19 times.
How many visits have you had to your Regret website? You mentioned it earlier.
Over 2 million in the last 7 years.
And weighted more recently, you're seeing the growth of it, right?
Yeah.
Right? Because now we've got enough time passed that the people who have been treated this way are now experiencing the confusion, the regret. The step they took that they thought would help them didn't fix the problem. The underlying issues are all still there.
Sex change regret. The people that come to my website are the people who regret, or they've read the website and they're going, maybe I shouldn't do this because I don't want to end up contacting you about regret.
Yeah. There were other indications of perhaps sanity. The American Academy of Pediatrics took a position as an organization that gender identity disorder should be accelerated and treated for children pre-puberty as quickly as possible. Enough doctors in the academy complained and said, you really are not speaking for us. And they asked for a vote of all the members. Is this a right course or should we re-examine it? And well over 80% of the pediatricians in the organization said, stop that train, re-examine this. We don't agree with what you've said.
All right, so there was a lot there. So again, as transgenderism is finding its way through the culture, we want to continue, as the first part of that excerpt was talking about, looking at the individual, and really not to miss this point that Walt, through the hundreds, thousands of conversations that he's had with folks who have experienced regret from transgender, is the idea that the gender dysphoria is really more of a symptom of something else going on in the mental health, and how important it is to get at the root of that. Because even a full transition and hormones and surgeries can only try and cover up that symptom or make adjustments to that particular symptom. The underlying mental health issues are still there, and if left untreated, that's what's going to be leading to things like suicide and depression and all those things that these individuals are wrestling with.
That's right. You do such a profound disservice to people in not getting to the underlying pathologies. So it's not only a wrong diagnosis, it's a profound disservice to these kids, because it takes our eyes off of the other issues that are not being examined.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, the conversation along those lines puts into focus kind of what we can start to frame as a good response for Christians to think about, in that we need to be for these individuals, learning their stories and helping them to understand God's creation and God's design in a loving way, so that we can come alongside them and not have them feeling like we're against them or mad at them or not for them. Because ultimately we want to be for people, but we want to be for them to live out their God-given design, God-given purpose in the truth of what God designed.
And part of the challenge with that is in the sort of the cultural world of transgenderism. And I know this from talking to individuals who transitioned, some who, like Walt, came out and detransitioned, others who are still in it, but I've tried to develop relationships or even friendships. And the difficulty is the culture says to them, this is who you really are. If a person truly loves you, they're going to accept your decision. If they don't accept your decision, then they're really not your friend. They're really opposed to you, and that kind of thing. Now, think about that in other contexts. If, for example, somebody had a substance abuse issue, would we ever say to a person, or a gambling addiction, would we ever say, well, that's who you are? There's a compulsion, yes, but if people really love you, they're going to affirm you in the behavioral choices that you're engaging in. We get it. There are some clearly that are bad. If we love a person, we don't affirm those choices. Now, that's very different. Somebody who now is struggling with gender identity is going to say, well, that's not a fair comparison. This is a sense of my personal identity. I get that, but I think it's nonetheless fair to have that conversation with people. That, look, granted, you may be experiencing this and feeling this, but have you stopped to think about other issues in your life? What were you struggling with anything before the thought came to you that you might be the wrong gender, before anybody ever planted that idea in your mind, were there other issues that you were struggling with? And I think we want to have that conversation and try to get past that barrier that if you don't accept my choice, then you really don't care about me and I'm closing you off.
Yeah, exactly. And those are all great ways to be for someone, to love someone, and yet be real clear about truth. Now, on the flip side, if there is something to be against, what else you were talking about with Walt related to organizations and policies being put forth that do this disservice of ignoring underlying mental health issues and simply fast track the transgender transitions and all of that, that's something to keep an eye on and really, I would say, resist.
That's right. As human beings, we're kind of hardwired to respect authority. The challenge is when you hear that the American Psychological Association or this group or that group has taken a position, the challenge is those groups tend to be a small group of people with political sensitivities, and they often do not speak for the profession. Yet in general debate, you show up and somebody's saying in the audience and they're wondering and they hear, oh, the APA said this, oh, the AMA said that. It gives this undue weight to it as if that closes the topic. In fact, now sometimes you'll hear in the discussion, medical standards of care are such and such. Like that's supposed to end the discussion. Well, medical standards of care were not that, 10 years ago or 15 years ago. Well, since when did that suddenly carry the day? So I think we have to be a little open to ask, well, hold on, who are these organizations? This, in fact, violates standards of care in the psychiatric profession for many, many decades. And now all of a sudden a small group at the top says, no, that's not the case. We speak for the profession. I can tell you from personal experience, speaking to many psychiatrists, some Christians, some not, who have said to me privately, I can't go public and say this. I'll be destroyed if I do. But what we're doing now is insane. We all know that. We've always said wait through puberty, and yet the profession is preempting us, and we really don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, that's so important to be able to keep an eye on when it comes to opportunities that we do have to be able to speak out against things like policy and how things are progressing on a more systemic scale. And so the last excerpt that we're going to hear today is you and Walt are talking specifically about what the church can do, what can be our response, and issues around that. Let's take a listen.
What can we do as Christians? We hear these stories, they make us crazy and all that. What do we do as a church, as Christians? How do we respond to this?
Yeah, I think it comes back to understanding that something happened to them and learning, try to find out what that is. And as I said earlier, for the young people, it could be just a social issue, social contagion. The kids who are not popular, who can't make friends with anybody, they can identify as transgender in a heartbeat, and they've got this large group of people. It's kind of an addiction of sorts to jump into this and just do this because I can gain quick friends. I mean, I had a young person tell me, he contacted me from Palm Springs, and he had regret, and it's a great example. He's in a family of 9 children, and he said, I wasn't noticed. And he said, so I went and had breast implants and decided that I would identify as a female. And I said, when I asked him why, he said, because I wanted to be noticed.
And there was all the attention, right? More attention than they ever had in their life, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But now he's got, it took us a year to work with a friend of mine, psychotherapist in the desert, and he's now detransitioned back, and he's got his life back, and he realized, the harm that's done by it. And that's the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. The harm that is done and the pain that's done. The girls who have their breasts taken off at 13, 12, they're not going to get them back. The guys that have these genital surgeries, they want, we're working with 26, he said, I want to have kids. He's not going to be able to have kids. We need to step back and look at the consequences and look at what's really happening.
All right, so I love the end again. Walt brought it back to the individual. What is going on? What is in their story? What can we learn from them? How can we best love them and help them walk through the challenges that they've experienced in life? And really, it comes down to this concept of identity. He had this example of a student who suddenly found acceptance and everybody was for him when before he was an outcast, of people trying to find an identity in something. And we know as Christians, the Bible tells us that looking for our identity in anything, and we all can do this. We can look for our identity in our families, in our work. We can try and find our identity in our spouse and then get so frustrated when they don't meet that particular need. Any identity that we're seeking outside of our identity in Christ is going to leave us coming up short, empty, and not address the things that are going on in our lives. And so the encouragement that Walt has in the area of transgender and people who are experiencing gender dysphoria, to be able to really come alongside them, to learn their stories, use that as the starting point, to step back, look at what's really going on, is such an encouragement.
Yeah, the thing that always hits me about Walt when I speak with him or listen to him is how much he loves people. And I think if I were going to characterize his approach and why it's so effective, I would say because that becomes clear. You can tell that he is interested in the person and he wants to hear from the person. And I think when we love the person, we want to see them as God sees them. The individual becomes less of a theoretical thing. It's not so much a political argument. Yes, there are times we're going to have arguments in the political sphere. What should legislation look like? What policies do we want? I think we do less good as believers kind of sitting on a couch and roaring loudly, "That's right, get them," or something. I think we do much more good when we are interacting with the individuals and we're loving people. And I think of some of the description of love that Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 13, and I see so much of that in Walt's approach. Love is patient. Love is kind. It doesn't boast. It's not arrogant. Walt does not argue with people. And I love the end of that description. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. I have counseled with people going through these things. Don't ever give up on the individual. We start the conversation and we lead, and our motivation is love and the good of the individual. I feel like other things then fall into place.
Yeah, 100%. So just some real quick practical next steps. I think there are some next steps for those who don't currently have a personal connection to anybody experiencing the transgender phenomenon or gender dysphoria. Maybe they're just an attendee of a church. Inevitably, there are going to be people who come into their church, our church. There are people who are currently transgender and identifying as the other gender. We're going to meet them, have conversations with them, and begin to learn their stories and hear about them, get to know them, so that we can share the incredible hope that's in Christ. Is a great place to start in the church.
Right. And I would just add this because some listeners might hear this and not understand the full message. We never teach something contrary to what the Bible says. We believe in creational truth. We do not compromise on that. And at the same time, we love those individuals and we want to be Christ's redemption for them. So having the one is not a compromise of the other. We don't want to be on one end of it that we're legalistic and angry and we're telling people you don't belong here. Boy, if sinners don't belong in the church, then we're all in a lot of trouble. None of us would have ever gotten anywhere.
Yes, and that's an important distinction. But then I think the next step also on the personal level now for listeners who maybe they have a family member who's identifying as transgender, or it's a parent and their child, their teenager has come home from school. It was just Pride Month as of our recording just recently, in which you've had scenarios where parents have a son or daughter come home and say, you know what, I just need to let you know, I no longer identify as a boy, I identify as a girl. This is my new name. And parents are now left to respond. And so a first step, I think, also in that scenario is love. Parentally, unconditional love, and yet, as you were saying, Joe, not compromising on the truth and walking that delicate balance, but also understanding that, man, there is help. There are people like Walt Heyer. There are resources now pretty abundantly that even just 2 or 3 years ago didn't exist in the Christian world, but resources now that you can get a hold of if you're in and a part of Highlands Church, we would certainly love to come alongside you and walk through you with that. But just to understand that while that can be a shocking moment in time, that there is always hope, as you mentioned before, Joe, of a way forward, and that God will walk through that with you.
That's right. And Walt's main websites are Walt Heyer, HEYER.com, and sexchangeregret.com. He's got a number of his books there, Trans Life Survivors, A Transgender's Faith, and materials like that would be very helpful. And if people write to him on the website, he'll answer all of his emails. So we have those individuals. And the other thing, kind of a problem maybe more familiar to many of us is kids or whatever grandkids come home from school or some environment, and they might not say, "Oh, I'm transgender," but they'll come home instead and they'll say, "Oh, we've learned how transgender people have been mistreated, and I believe in that now. And I want transgender rights," and so they're now simply espousing those things, and then those things open the door to other kinds of issues, and so we want to be sensitive there as well, rather than an argument with those kids. Well, sit down, tell me what you were taught. Have you looked into this? Are you interested? Do you want to read more about that? Do you want to hear the stories that are mounting up of people who did just what you're saying and ended up regretting it? Are you open to hear those stories? In many cases, perhaps they will be. So we want to encourage those things as well.
Absolutely. And so this conversation will continue. But as always, if this conversation today has been helpful for you, we'd encourage you to share it with a friend, encourage them to subscribe as we continue on this podcast to look at issues facing us in our culture and seek to understand and process those issues from a biblical perspective. Another way you can always help us out is by rating or reviewing the show, not because we want the validation or anything like that, but really it helps the digital algorithms understand that this is content that people find valuable, and our hope is that more people would be able to approach these cultural issues from the Bible's viewpoint, that we would be able to equip and empower Christians to be able to do this. So in any way that you'd like to engage with this content, that would be a huge help. But we thank you for listening. We can't wait to welcome you back for our next conversation.